Okay, well, thanks to Harry and to Michael and to Atheist Ireland for the opportunity to speak. I was rather alarmed to discover that I was to speak on the same event as a comedian because I'm totally humourless. So brace yourselves. In fact, on one of my student evaluations last year, which are always very amusing because it's filled out by people who never came to the lectures. My favourite entry was that Dr. Daly is clearly very learned, however, he is also very boring. So you have been forewarned. Brace yourselves. In relation to AC, well, I hemmed between a comedian and AC grading, and I'm not as entertaining as either. But when I hear the name AC grading, I always think of the French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, or BHL as they call him, who was the sort of the French AC grading in some respects. And the satirical quote was attributed to him. God is dead, but my hair is perfect. And I always think of that when I hear about AC grading. I also follow with interest his plan around setting up an elite private university, which apparently is going to charge 19,000 sterling a year for tuition. And it does. I mean, that does. When I speak to a group of atheists, to Atheist Ireland, I mean, it does make you reflect on what kind of beliefs actually bind atheists together. Whether there is a common theme around which atheists or humanists can never really rally, or whether it's defined negatively in terms of the exclusion of the theists. Whether the real conflict is actually political. Of course, that's something which that's not something I've been asked to talk about. I've been asked to talk about religion and schools, but maybe you can ask Mr. Grading about that next week. Is it? Okay. Anyway, to get to what I've actually been asked to talk about, and within a limited physical range, because I tend to pace, so I'm not going to pace this evening. But I suppose I want to talk in very general, non-anarchic terms around the question of religion and Irish schools, which of course is an issue of concern to many atheists and humanists, and to other what you might call belief minorities, to use an awful term in Irish society. What I want to talk about in particular are the strategies that are used in public discourse to give a new modern justification or legitimation to the denominational model, using the secular liberal terminologies of diversity, choice, and of freedom itself. So how has it come to pass that more or less the same educational model that applied in Ireland at the time of the enactment of the Constitution in the 30s, which was a heavily religious society, is still applied in a more or less structurally unchanged form today, using a rather different justification, but with that model itself having the same structure and the same concrete effects on human rights and on freedom of religion in particular, as Harry alluded to in his introduction. So, I mean, increasing attention is focused in recent years on the appropriateness of what you might call the patronage model in Irish education, and its appropriateness in an era of religious diversity and in an era of decline of religious practice and religious belief in Irish society. And by the model of patronage, patronage in Irish education doesn't refer necessarily to its denominational character as such. Formally speaking, the denominational character of Irish education is almost incidental. You don't really find reference to it anywhere in law or in any other document. There's no prescription that the schools will be denominational. It's rather cleverer than that, and it's rather more oblique than that. And we have a disparity between a sort of a public philosophy of education and a constitution and a legal framework for education, which is formally pluralist in theory and in philosophy, but which in practice is heavily dominated by religious denominations and by one particular denomination, specifically the Roman Catholic Church. So you might think, if you were to observe the actual real structure of Irish education, that there was some prescription somewhere that the schools will be Catholic or the schools will be religious or whatever it might be. That's actually not the case. By the patronage model, I mean something quite different. I mean the model according to which public education in Ireland is sort of partitioned over public and private spheres, in the sense that the state has a responsibility to provide public education, but for a number of historical reasons in Ireland, it's never done this by directly providing it itself. It sort of devolves or delegates the provision of public education to privately owned and managed schools, which in practice are almost entirely denominational in nature, and so the state funds and regulates the schools, but the ethos and the management of the schools is taken care of by the denominations themselves. So what's unique in Ireland isn't the fact of state support for religious schools as such. Even in the supposedly rabidly secular France, the state also funds a system of religious schools parallel to the state system. But what is interesting and unusual about Ireland, and what's problematic in Ireland, is the absence of any parallel default universal system of public secular education, which provides, I suppose, a minimum guarantee that at least whatever about the compatibility of the public education system with one's beliefs, that at least one can attend school in which one isn't subject to the inculcation or the indoctrination of any specific comprehensive doctrine, whether it's atheist or religious or whatever it might be, that, to use a very problematic term, that one has access to a neutral school which doesn't in fact implicate any particular doctrine in children. So what has happened over the past decade, and over the past 3 or 4 years in particular, is that there has been an increasing consensus that there needs to be some sort of reform in Irish education, particularly given the fact that you have a situation where over 90% of primary schools are under the management not only of denominations, but of one single denomination particularly. But the discussion around reform hasn't really focused on any possibility of implementing a properly secular public non-denominational system, but rather simply readjusting the distribution of patronage, so to speak, within the current system, so that you would diversify those private bodies and groups which have the right to be patron bodies in education and which actually deliver public education according to a particular set of beliefs. And so there has been, I suppose, there has been a defensive reaction in respect to denominational schools, whereby the main actors in education have agreed that change needs to be implemented, but within the structure and the rationale of the existing patronage system. There has been no real discussion or no real suggestion of a more radical overhaul of Irish education which would involve the state accepting a fuller responsibility for its provision and guaranteeing this in every part of the national territory that, at a minimum, that a non-sectarian, non-denominational education would be provided to citizens of all beliefs and none. Instead, the discourse has centred around the possibility of diversifying patronage within the current model, and what that essentially entails is that, subject to demand in particular areas, yes, you could have secular schools, non-denominational schools, even atheist schools potentially, insofar as sufficient parental demands for that particular model of school exists. And that represents a very particular model of religious freedom. It assumes that religious freedom in education, or freedom of conscience in education if you prefer, put in a more secular way, that it doesn't mean that it's a negative right, that you have the right to be left alone in the development and the choice of your beliefs. For most reasonable people, I think, freedom of religion means the right in schools, means the right to attend a school without being subject to any particular indoctrination in any particular set of beliefs. But the discourse which has tried to legitimate and justify some approximation of the current system constructs the idea of religious freedom in a very specific and different way, and that justification claims that what religious freedom actually means is a much more comprehensive and ambitious claim, which is the right to receive education in a school, which specifically reflects your comprehensive worldview, your set of ethical or religious beliefs, or whatever they might be. So the defence of the patronage model has centred on the idea not that Ireland is a Catholic country or a Catholic state, or that there's some privilege for Catholicism, or even for religion as such. The prevailing idea that is accepted by the educational actors, by government, and by a lot of public figures, is that the function of a public education system should be to positively reflect the specific beliefs of the citizens, and therefore to provide education through schools whose ethos is specifically attuned to the actual beliefs in society. And that means that parents are free to receive positive support in the religious or the ethical education of their children, and that's what religious freedom. That's how religious freedom in Irish education has been understood. The prevailing idea of religious freedom in Irish schools has been that the state should positively recognise the different religious beliefs in society, that it can't have what is often derided as a one-size-fits-all system of secular or non-sectarian schools. And of course, insofar as religious freedom then is constructed as meaning that you have the right to a specific form of religious education or ethical education at the expense of the state, then that essentially means that you will limit religious freedom according to various considerations of resources and power. In other words, the discourse at the moment is that yes, you can establish an atheist or you can establish an atheist or a Dawkinsian, are we allowed to say that? Yes, a school, or you can establish a Hare Krishna or a Scientologist school or whatever it might be, because the constitution and the legislation is formally speaking neutral between the denominations and other groups. The idea is that you can establish those as an alternative to the prevailing Catholic system, but you can only establish those insofar as sufficient demand exists and insofar as certain conditions are met in a particular area. And what that means essentially is that the right of individuals to avail of religious freedom in education, the right of individuals to have freedom of conscience in education, depends on such arbitrary considerations like how many of you there are that happen to be in a particular area of the state, whether you can muster the resources and the power and the clout that are necessary to gain recognition for an alternative model of school that specifically reflects your beliefs. So the idea under the philosophical, the political, the legal idea underpinning the denominational model isn't privilege for religion as such. It isn't privilege for Catholicism either. The formal idea, the theoretical idea underpinning it is that the state is formally neutral between religions. There is a formal equality not only between the denominations, but also between the denominations and other non-denominational groups. For example, in the 1990s, there was an attempt to establish and have the state recognise a Steiner school in County Clare, and they took it to the High Court, and the High Court said that the Constitution actually does positively entitle those parents to have the state recognise and fund the school, but only insofar as certain minimum rational criteria are met, and those parents couldn't find any teachers who were both qualified in the Steiner methodology, but also who were qualified to teach in Irish, and therefore their case ultimately failed. So the point there, and the lesson there, is that there is a formal theory. The state is, officially speaking, neutral between denominations and neutral between denominations and non-denominational entities, but formal equality for religions in the education system doesn't translate, and it has never translated into equal religious freedom for individuals within the denominational model. Within the denominational model, the right of people to avail of religious freedom on the rationale that we currently have depends on the relative power that their group possesses in society. It depends on features as arbitrary as number, the resources they have that go towards the process of school recognition. It depends on how well positioned different faith communities and non-faith communities are to successfully negotiate the very difficult process of school recognition. So the main response, the main reaction from establishment figures, from government and from civil society towards the demand for a more non-denominational education system has been, yeah, very well, have the right to non-denominational education. We don't deny you that. Sure, leave our Catholic schools alone and establish another school, a secular school, a Dawkinsian school, or an atheist school, or a humanist school, or whatever you want. But of course, I'm not sure what kind of human right it means, or what kind of vision of human rights it entails, where you think that the exercise or the realisation of that right depends on the number of you that might exist in a particular area that might demand or that might assert that right. And it's a particularly, it's a very peculiar idea of educational freedom, that your right to educational freedom would depend on you actually going about establishing a school necessary to your own beliefs. that in a sense we have a very we have an overambitious idea of what religious freedom in education entails. The state could never provide across all areas of the nation the full schools that reflect the full range of beliefs that exist, or beliefs or non-beliefs that exist in society. And so I think that we need to scale back the idea of what religious freedom in public education entails. I think we need to say that it doesn't entail the right to avail of public education in an ethos that specifically reflects any particular set of beliefs. I think that we need to more realistically set out that what religious freedom or freedom of conscience in schools entails is the right to avail of public education in a denominationally neutral environment, in a common school, so to speak, which doesn't really address the comprehensive questions of the ultimate truth or otherwise of religion, or the ultimate question of what it means to live a good life or an ethical life or whatever it might be, but which provides public education on the basis of neutrality between the different comprehensive theories such as religion and atheism and so on and so forth. I mean, for religious freedom or freedom of conscience for atheists and humanists, currently in Irish law and in the official philosophy of educational freedom in Ireland, what religious freedom and freedom of conscience mean for those groups is the right to establish schools. And I think that the right of educational freedom has been too closely associated with the right to establish schools. But it's not easy to establish schools. It's not easy to have the state fund and recognise those schools. And it's too high a barrier to set. It's too high a threshold to set to access the right to educational freedom. It should apply irrespective of whether a particular faith community or non-faith community actually has the resources, the numbers and the power to establish a school which is specifically appropriate to that alternative set of beliefs. I think that instead the right to avail of education freedom shouldn't depend on any private initiative. It shouldn't depend on the resources that a particular community holds. The responsibility should ultimately fall with the state to provide a universal system of common schools, of non-sectarian schools, in which citizens can avail of their right to religious freedom in education without having to go through the process of school establishment, with all the hazards of money and power and resources and numbers that process entails. And so what we have in modern Ireland, what we have in post-Catholic Ireland, if you like, or secular Ireland, is a system in which the state remains formally neutral towards religion, in which we increasingly have a formally secular state, a state which is neutral not only between religions, but between religion and non-religion, but within which the right to enjoy freedom of conscience in schools depends on some sectarian competition between the different faith communities or non-faith communities that can muster the resources that are necessary to attract recognition and support within the logic and the structure of the current patronage model. There's an awful lot of mealy-mouthed talk, frankly, about diversity and choice. The idea that the patronage model, by providing education through plurality of different schools, protects the right to parental choice. But that notion of parental choice is very easily constructed. The idea isn't necessarily that parents, wherever they might live or whatever they might believe, universally enjoy the right to freedom of choice in terms of the beliefs that they want, in which they want to educate their children. The idea is instead of is some sort of sectarian or tribal division of the educational cake, so to speak. The idea is that freedom of choice means that the state, in some sort of plebiscitary majoritarian notion, would take account of the majority preference in a particular area, and then would positively adjust education provision so as to take account for preferences. The idea is that the state should ultimately provide education through those schools which parents are believed to actually choose. And so the provision of public education through Catholic schools is today justified on the assumption that actually reflects the preferences or the choice, so to speak, of parents, even though there's no actual mechanism in place in Ireland through which actual parental preference could actually be ascertained. But I would say that even if you did put in place some sort of mechanism, such as a local plebiscite or a survey or whatever, through which parents could actually choose, that wouldn't be a very democratic notion, in fact. That wouldn't be a very appropriate notion of educational freedom, because ultimately it's not about numbers. If you took freedom of educational choice or freedom of religion in education seriously as a human right, you wouldn't make it depend on how many of you there were in a particular area. It wouldn't matter whether there were 3 Lutherans or 3,000 Lutherans. Their exercise of religious freedom shouldn't have to depend on their capacity to attract state recognition for a school that specifically reflects their beliefs. The idea then is that if they can't attract that recognition, the only protection the state offers is that they can withdraw from formal timetabled religious instruction classes within the local Catholic school in whatever rural area of the state it might be. And as we all know, and as I'm sure you're all aware, that is a very bit part, a very inadequate, a very limited protection of freedom of educational choice. Because, of course, the idea, the prevalent idea, is that the Catholic schools enjoy the right, as it's called, to inculcate the ethos of the school throughout the whole school day, and not just in the formally timetabled religious classes. Therefore, obviously, the right to withdraw your child from the religious instruction classes doesn't fully protect your right to educate your child in those beliefs you see fit. So we have very much a twin-track protection of educational freedom in Ireland, an unequal protection of religious freedom in Ireland, as between. And the higher level of protection of religious freedom, I suppose, is the idea that faith communities can establish schools and have the state support schools that are specifically appropriate to their beliefs. And the residual or the lesser protection then is the idea that, well, if you don't have the numbers or the resources necessary to establish a school specifically appropriate to your beliefs, then all you enjoy then is the very partial right to withdraw from religious classes in the local Catholic denominational school. And to me, and I think to most reasonable people, and to all of you here, I think that constitutes an unacceptable inequality in how the state protects religious freedom in our educational system. And I say that if we can't remedy that, we can't make that better simply by diversifying in some areas of the state, and particularly in Dublin and the cities. We can't make that better simply by diversifying those patrons or those school owners or school managers that are recognised by the state, because no matter how you tweak the system or diversify within the patronage model, ultimately, unless you have a universal common school, a universal non-sectarian school, as exists in most European countries, in nearly every European country bar Ireland, then still the right to religious freedom in education, the right to not be indoctrinated in Catholic beliefs, the right to not attend a Catholic school, will still depend on the contingencies of number and the contingencies of power. And I think that it's not a very democratic idea of religious freedom, nor indeed is it a very Christian idea of religious freedom, that your right to that should depend on the numbers and the power of those who demand that right. And so I think that that's why when people talk about how it's appropriate that we must diversify or change the education system to reflect the more diverse nature of Irish society, I don't buy that. I don't buy that for a second. I think that's very mealy-mouthed. I think that's very I don't think that's in good faith. I think that the right to religious freedom in education isn't simply a matter of adjusting to social change. I think it always existed. Suggesting that it's now appropriate to change the structure of Irish education in response to social change, that somehow suggests that there was some past era in which it might have been appropriate to completely devolve educational provision to the churches on the assumption of some sort of romantic, non-existent past in which everybody believed in a religion, or in which Ireland was perfectly homogeneously religious. That era never existed. People always think different things. People always disagree with each other, even within religions and within faith and non-faith communities, as I'm sure and as I hope you and Atheism Ireland disagree with each other about all sorts of ethical and political questions. And I think that that has been a particularly naive and optimistic assumption of the patronage model in Irish education. The idea being that you can protect the rights and the freedom of a particular group in society by devolving education provision to a patron who is assumed to represent that homogeneous unitary group as if they were all the same. I mean, a lot of things are justified in relation to the census, that a particular number of people picked Catholic or atheists on the census or whatever it might be, and that justifies the relative number of schools that the state has recognised and funded. Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. What gives the patron the right to represent that particular group? Even if you accept the logic, the modern logic of the patronage model, which is diversity and choice in the new mealy-mouthed secular terminology, even if you accepted that logic of the patronage model, well then how could you ever say that the patron represented the beliefs of those parents? What is the nexus of accountability between the ordinary citizen parents and between the so-called patron? And that would apply as equally if the state were to fund a range of atheist or humanist schools, as it would apply in the current system of Catholic patronage. How would you determine an atheist patron, or a humanist patron? How would you ever ascertain any kind of legitimacy in that patron? How can you ever protect religious freedom or freedom of choice in education by dividing society up according to a tribal sectarian analysis through which you can devolve the rights and the interests, you can delegate the protection of the rights and interests of each group to some sort of mysterious figure called a patron who can somehow embody and express the legitimate choices and preferences of that group. I mean, in the real world, people don't operate, they don't exist like that. You have differences within groups as well as you have between groups. So the equality of protection of religious freedom, it's not just an inequality between majority and minority groups, it's an inequality that cuts across groups. It applies to Catholic parents, maybe to liberal Catholic parents, in as much as it applies to atheists and humanists and Lutherans or whatever you might have. I think that a fuller, a more consistent and a more equal system of protection of religious freedom in Irish schools would completely decouple or disassociate that protection from the capacity of groups to attract recognition for their schools. So I think that we must recognise that there is a huge danger in trying to reduce the question of freedom in education to what is the appropriate prerogatives or the appropriate entitlements that you recognise as between the different groups. We must have a more individualist analysis in which we recognise the differences within as well as between groups, and which recognises that you can't protect religious freedom in education simply by carving up the educational cake or the funds and the recognition available for schools as between the different tribal, the different sectarian and non-sectarian communities or tribes, so to speak. So if we take seriously the idea of religious freedom in education, it must be something than the negotiation of competing social interests. It must transcend that. And that's why the language surrounding diversity is very harmful. It's very damaging, because that suggests that it's about some kind of celebration of social change, that somehow Ireland's changed, that the education system must therefore change as well. It's about more than adjusting to social and demographic change. It's about reflecting and protecting something that is more universal than that, which is the right simply to not be subject to any interference by the state or by any agents of the state, including the churches, in your choice of belief and the development of your beliefs. So that's the main sense in which I would say that the overwhelming flaw in the current public debate and surrounding the reform of denominational education is that you can simply fix the problem by diversifying those groups and communities and patrons which participate and enjoy the benefits of the current system. You need a more radical reform which decouples the right to religious freedom from the prerogatives recognised for specific belief or non-belief communities. So I think that that is the main strategy that must be used to try to resist the reaction from the Catholic right wing in particular to the demands to change the denomination system, because the reaction of the Catholic right wing has been to accept and to appropriate liberal language and liberal terminology, and to accept that the main yardstick actually is freedom, is choice, and is diversity. But the Catholic right wing has identified that this language of diversity and choice actually suits its interests. That if they can somehow establish that what religious freedom in schools should entail is simply the idea that the state should recognise the majority beliefs in a particular area, whatever they might be, they have recognised and identified that they can preserve the essence of the current system simply by changing its justification. 30 years ago or so, you would have been told, well, this is a Catholic country, suck it up. And nobody really buys that anymore. Nobody dares to say that. So what is said instead is that, parents should have what they want. It's a sort of an idea of consumer choice. Give the citizens their preference of religious ethos. And the calculation, the very cynical calculation, if you ask me, has been that, well, if the Catholic right wing accepts that new justification for the denomination system, that they can somehow preserve essentially the same model, but using a different justification, that they can preserve the same dangerous fusion of church and state in the provision of public schools within a formal facade of neutrality, within a formal rhetorical facade of diversity and freedom and choice, which is, I think, an argument that is ultimately deployed in bad faith and which must be intelligently resisted in public debate. So I think that I've probably spoken for long enough, or too long, so I'd be very happy to engage you in questions or debate or whatever you might have to say. Okay, thanks.